The territory occupied by the Western group of troops in East Prussia was very small. The most important link with the outside world was the harbour of the town of Rosenberg. Boats and barges went from there to Pillow, and the wounded were sent on large ships to Swinemunde, to Kiel, or to Copenhagen. The wounded arriving at Heiligenbiel were taken there from the divisional field surgical hospitals. Then, one by one, the field surgical hospitals began to be transferred to Heiligenbiel, until eventually as many as 20 medical companies crowded into the tiny and the hospitals were constantly overcrowded, to the point where wounded soldiers were forced to sit on the steps. It became extremely difficult to feed them, but even more difficult to provide them with proper care, and these problems were getting worse by the day. Ambulance drivers sometimes had to drive for hours from one hospital to another to drop off the wounded. Rigo and I knew from bitter experience what such long waits for ambulances meant to the surgical field hospitals. Most of these hospitals operated in close proximity to the front lines and were under fire almost all the time. The aircraft factory had a large number of workshops and various outbuildings which could well be put in order, but our field hospital was too small a unit, with only about 60 men serving, and we were constantly short of men. This winter was much harsher than in previous years. The workshops and outbuildings were looted by Russian prisoners of war, guarded by only a handful of soldiers. Window and door frames were broken out and used as fuel, and even some light metal alloy, which lay in large quantities in the factory grounds, was burned by the freezing prisoners. For this they could not be blamed. But when we needed all the buildings on the factory grounds to accommodate the wounded, I asked that all the Russian prisoners be moved to the barracks opposite the entrance to the factory. Naturally, nothing came of this. One of the Russian doctors working at the camp was from Krasnodar, and he had tears in his eyes when he learnt that I had been there. He was assigned a ward with the sick in our hospital, and he received as much food and medicine as he needed. Those Russian prisoners who were wounded during the air raid we placed in our 2 hospitals. But the Russian doctor could do nothing to help us in terms of getting all the prisoners out of the factory. So I turned to the head of the local garrison, an honoured veteran of the First World War. He broke away from his coffee. I was given 2 companies of the Labour Battalion, which were ordered to guard the factory grounds. We had to allocate 20 pairs of soldiers, each to make the guard quite effective. We repaired the very comfortable factory kitchen and canteen, replaced all the broken windows, brought in several cars of straw, and bought a dozen stoves to heat the back rooms. The shortage of blankets was appalling. Every week between 100 and 200 blankets disappeared without a trace, and we had to send special groups to escort barges to Pillow to make sure our blankets and stretchers came back. Every morning Rigo would assemble a group of the sick and wounded who were able to move on their own, and then appoint a senior officer or non-commissioned officer to take charge of it. He would then send this group to Danzig. It was frightful to look at them as they passed us in silence and with an angry expression on their faces, but they seldom expressed their displeasure aloud. Occasionally we bring back some old man whom an overzealous corporal had included in the column, and the effect was always pacifying. We would not have sent these unfortunates out of the hospital in this way at all, if we had not known what incredible hardships they would have to undergo if they remained in the cauldron. At first they could reach Danzig by way of Elbing, but later, when the Russians advanced further, it became possible to reach that city only by way of the Frische Nierung, the isthmus separating the Frisches Gulf from the Bay of Danzig. Convoys of these unfortunates had to walk on the ice of Frisches Gulf. Most of the patients had to be taken out by lorry, but such a task was clearly beyond our transport capabilities. In order to save the seriously injured, we had to pay less attention to the sick and lightly wounded. I don't even want to think about how many thousands of times I was cursed during those ice crossings. The columns of walking wounded were joined by all sorts of dubious elements who also wanted to escape from the cauldron. In principle, it was our duty to separate the goats from the sheep, but we were simply unable to cope with such a pile of problems. When large groups of men do not feel in control, they become unmanageable, and it takes a lot of effort to bring order among them. What criterion should we have followed? There was probably not one infantryman who did not deserve a rest after a long stay at the front, and to order him back to the front in such circumstances would simply be to send him to certain death. Most soldiers in such a situation would simply tear up their discharge certificate and go to the next hospital. Almost certainly he would have been admitted to one of the 20 hospitals that were in Heiligenbeil at the time. The number of patients in our hospital continued to grow rapidly, despite our best efforts to reduce the number in any way. I remember that one day we counted 1,200. The air raids were becoming more and more frequent, and we had to reduce the number of patients at all costs. In addition, we were in dire need of medical personnel, so Rigo and I set about finding them. We kept the house open to all comers, and Moccasin made coffee and sandwiches from morning to evening. This became well known in the neighborhood, and all sorts of people came to visit us. One day, a whole brigade of surgeons turned up, now in fact under no one's command, as their division had been taken prisoner by the Russians, and they were immediately invited to stay and help us. In any case, however, this problem had to be officially solved. Fortunately, the garrison chief, who was so fond of coffee, had at this time been given command of all military operations in the Heiligenbeil area, so he could issue any order he saw fit. He ordered the newly arrived surgical team to stay to work in our hospital, so we now had the opportunity to operate on 4 tables at the same time. Rigau persuaded the chief surgeon of the army group, a true virtuoso of the scalpel, also to join us, so that we got at our disposal an exceptionally good specialist. However, he began to work in the manner to which he was accustomed in the big rear hospitals, while we only had a field hospital, so the week it took him to get used to the new conditions was quite hard on him. We captured an ownerless transport unit that had 5 large buses at its disposal. It used to work at the rear warehouse, and the drivers were happy to stay with us. Otherwise, their buses could be confiscated at any moment and they could be sent to some hastily assembled combat unit. This kind of man-hunting was commonplace at that time. 2 very beautiful Latvian nurses, who dropped in to warm up a bit and have a cup of hot coffee, stayed with us for 3 weeks and helped their Russian friends. One day, an SS captain who was in the security service came up to me. He said he had seen us working here, and as he was out of work at the moment, could he stay with us? We offered him coffee and cigarettes. Yes, he had been in Minsk for a long time. Yes, he served in the SD there. He'd like to know what the devil we're asking him. We have the impression that the devil knows exactly why. Now, Panini, said Rigaud suddenly, looking at the SS man carefully. From Rosenberg to Pillow, a passage for barges was made in the ice of the bay, but sometimes it froze completely, which led to a stoppage of navigation. Then we had to launch Pani on the ice to transport the seriously wounded. This was the name of 2-wheeled carts, which we borrowed from peasants from neighboring villages. On each such cart there were 2 stretchers and 1 or 2 sitting wounded. We covered the stretchers with large paper sacks, covered them with red-hot bricks, and gave the wounded a whole thermos of hot tea. If they were not caught in a snowstorm, the journey to Pillow usually took from 6 to 8 hours. The death rate from hypothermia was comparatively low. At first everything went well, but then the peasants began to put up various obstacles. We explained the essence of the case to the SS man, and he immediately understood everything. He coped brilliantly with his immediate duties. From that day on, 40 and sometimes 60 panis stood in front of the hospital every morning. The peasants no longer made a single complaining sound when they realized that they were dealing with a man from the Secret Service. In all, Rigaud sent 1,200 stretchers on carts that the captain managed to obtain, and the losses from hypothermia had to be accepted simply as a necessary evil. Our patients could not be evacuated any other way. Therefore, even an SS man was able to serve under the invisible flag for once in his life, mainly, of course, with his own methods. For many weeks, an endless stream of refugees streamed past our hospital, so we opened a special ward for sick and wounded women. Sometimes, when there was a particularly heavy troop movement, the army had to clear the road of refugees, and there was no other way but to push their wagons with the help of tanks to the side of the road. After that, women had to carry their children in their arms, and doctors became great experts at bringing to life children who were almost frozen in their mother's arms. Gradually, the flow of refugees dried up, and the personnel of the army rear began to move past us. It was strange to see what an enormous number of units were located there, and how many thousands of people assigned to them had survived the whole war without, in fact, exposing themselves to any risk. One day, the evacuation of the wounded by barge from Rosenberg to Pillow ceased completely, and the Army Group headquarters, which had hitherto been inside the cauldron, moved to Pillow with all the vehicles at its disposal, although there was hardly a single road left on which these vehicles could travel. It took us almost a week to get the wounded out on our pani and to restore the broken schedule. In the end, only the combat units remained inside the cauldron. The front line was getting closer and closer. The Russians began shelling the city with long-range artillery. The number of air raids also increased. We waited them out in bomb shelters under the administrative building. As a result of the narrowing of the front line, the number of divisions which sent their wounded to Heiligen Bale gradually decreased. The flow of wounded did not exceed the average figures typical of a major battle. Even so, our nurses could afford to take a nap, even for a short time, only if there was a lull of 1 or 2 days. It was now March, and it was getting a little warmer outside. The patients with head wounds were of the greatest concern to us. While they were with us, it was impossible to operate on them. There had already been several cases of artillery shells directly hitting the upper floors of the administration building, and one corner had been completely destroyed in an aeroplane bombardment. It was realized that the troops in the corps would not last as long as was necessary for the recovery period after cranial surgery. We had to evacuate such wounded by air. Not far from the aircraft factory there was an aerodrome, but it too was now under fire. Transport planes landed there and tried to unload them at maximum speed, and then they immediately took off. It happened more than once that while we were loading the wounded onto ambulances and taking them to the center of the airfield, the planes were already in the air. No orders were issued requiring pilots to take the wounded with them. Officially, this problem could only be solved through the Wehrmacht High Command, but given the situation, it is unlikely that anyone would do this. The pilots were acting on their own instructions. Indeed, they could hardly be expected to sit quietly under enemy fire and wait for the wounded to be brought in. On the other hand, because of the continuous enemy fire, it was impossible to collect the wounded on the airfield in advance. A solution to the problem was found by our new quartermaster. Not far from Heiligen Bale, he found a sugar factory where several hundred sacks of sugar, each weighing a centner each, were still stored. He confiscated them and offered the commander of the air unit 1 sack of sugar for each batch of wounded flown out. The pilots in Germany had families who were starving, and if the airfield was not under fire at the moment, a sack of sugar was worth the risk, although the situation could take a turn for the worse in 10 minutes. Now all the ambulances arriving at the airfield had 4 stretchers, 3 carrying patients with head wounds, and the 4th carrying a bag of sugar. In this way we managed to evacuate all such patients to Germany until the aerodrome finally ceased to function. One day we received an order to make a duplicate hospital prescription for each wounded man. For a long time we did not know the reason for such an order. But then a corporal who had been sent to Pillow to bring back our blankets and stretchers found out what was the matter. Ship with 2,000 wounded on board had been torpedoed by a Russian submarine soon after it left Pillow harbour. It sank within minutes, only a few of the wounded were saved, and it was impossible to identify the rest. Henceforth, a duplicate hospital order was filled out for any wounded man who came aboard the ship. Soon it was called a torpedo ticket. I disbanded the company that guarded the factory grounds. The kitchen and canteen were destroyed by a direct bomb hit during an air raid, and all the cooks died under their ruins. The surgical team that was helping us could no longer continue their work because the building in which they were performing operations was under constant fire. They left us. The commander of the local garrison, who had been a great help to us, paid a farewell visit to the hospital on the eve of the evacuation. Telephone communication was cut off. When the ice began to melt, We were left without our pack. The SS captain went to Pillow. The Latvian nurses decided to make their way to Danzig. Once again, we were left alone with the Russians. They were 8 kilometers away from us. On the territory of the aircraft factory, next to the administrative building, there was a house where the manager once lived. We never saw him. He fled at the first sign of approaching danger. Of all the staff, only a few engineers, foremen and old labourers remained at the plant. With sadness, they watched the destruction of the plant to which they had given many years of their lives. And, too touchingly and sincerely, they did everything they could to help us. When it became clear that Heiligenbeel would not be taken by the Russians from the get-go, the manager sent a special aeroplane from Germany to take away all his fishing equipment and several suitcases full of shoes. The pilot came straight to my room. He was a charming man and was very anxious about the case assigned to him. To assuage his conscience, we put 2 patients with head wounds on his plane. The shoes of Master Odebrecht, who lived in Berlin, Wilhelmstrasse, were very good indeed. We distributed them to the French prisoners of war, who were accompanying groups of refugees, and they were very pleased with the unexpected gift. Rigaud went to inspect the director's villa and came back very pleased. There is a radio receiver there in excellent condition. It's Sunday. In half an hour they'll be broadcasting Bruckner's Symphony in C minor. Shall we listen? We'll listen to it. We asked Moccasin if he wanted to come with us, and he brought coffee and vodka. Then we headed for the director's villa. The room was decorated lavishly, but completely tasteless. But most importantly, never before in my life had I seen a radio receiver of such enormous size. Within 2 minutes, Moccasin had found a coffee machine and large cut glasses. Everyone was comfortably seated in the soft armchairs, just sinking into them, throwing their legs over the table. We knew for certain that no one else would live here. Rigaud spent 1 or 2 minutes telling us about the music we were going to listen to. He was particularly fond of the 4th overture, in which the rustling of the forest leaves is suddenly interrupted by the dancing of the boys. While in the thick of life, this music says, "Do not forget death. The concert has begun." And at once the world filled with blood and disease, danger and pungent odours, fear and hunger, cold and despair, the poisoned and sick world in which we had lived for a long time, disappeared. Moccasin was still standing by the coffee machine, and I made a gesture for him to take a chair. He nodded slightly in acknowledgement. The first overture had finished. We looked at each other. No one said a word. We drank vodka. Then the second overture began. But our high spirits soon faded away. We all distinctly heard the whistle of a flying large-caliber shell with which the Russians had been shelling the city lately. During the adagio, we tried to catch a glimpse of this shell. For nearly 20 seconds we could hear the increasing whistle, as in some demonic crescendo. But it flew above us and exploded away. The house shook. The coffee cups shook. We took a big gulp of vodka each. 3 minutes later there was the whistle of another shell. This time it exploded a little closer. We looked at each other again. It was time to go down to the cellar. The second overture had finished. To go or not to go? In the middle of the third overture, the whistle of another shell was heard, and I asked, "Shall we go downstairs?" He glanced at me. "There's no need for that. Cheers." Everyone drank, and Moccasin filled our glasses with vodka again. The scherzo was over. Rigaud, see? Now comes the climax, the polyphony of trumpets in the 4th overture. This is probably the music of heaven. "We'll hear it again soon," said Moccasin. Rigaud suddenly turned to me. "We can't leave now. We have to hear it." From the expression on my face, he realized that I agreed. The 4th overture began, and in a moment we heard a host of angels and their praises to the Creator. When the overture ended, we went to the bomb shelter. In the corridor, we saw 10 French prisoners of war. We already had one Frenchman working in our hospital. He had previously been an assistant gardener in Heiligenbeel, and when he left the city, he came to us. Now he brought his mates to us too. Their guards had escaped, but they didn't want to be idle. I made a short speech and told them that they could stay with us. that they would be treated as Germans and fed just like the rest of us if they tended the wounded. A young Marquis from Brittany spoke from their side. He complimented me on my French and asked me where I had learnt it. When I told him that I had studied at the Sorbonne for several terms, he laughed. Between the tanks coming at us from the east and the shore of Frischesgaff Bay, in the last pockets of resistance still remaining in the encircled cauldron, in which yesterday's victors were dying and yesterday's prisoners were to be tomorrow's victors, this was probably the last time the two nations laughed together. The last time I was in Paris was in 1940, a few days after it had been occupied by German troops. Of the officers in our division, I was the only one who knew the city, and they asked me to give them a tour. The streets were deserted. Only from one chimney there was a puff of smoke. The wonderful blue mist with which the city had been so cosily coloured in peacetime had completely disappeared. We approached the Arc de Triomphe. The fire over the tomb of the unknown soldier had been relit only a few hours before. Daffodils lay on the slab with the famous inscription, "Here rests the French soldier who died for his country." The officers put their hands to their visors, and the commander of the engineer company, he had fought at Verdun as a lieutenant, placed a bouquet of violets on the stone. They lay on the word motherland, two French women dressed in all black, who were sitting on a bench next to the monument, rose from their seats, and we, slightly embarrassed, saluted. The women expressed their gratitude to us. The monument to the unknown soldier epitomizes World War I Europe. The Second World War left no such symbol, although in a sense it could be considered a united Europe. The Marquis supervised the loading of the wounded into the ambulances during the brief pauses between the intense shelling, pauses that became shorter and shorter, so that towards the end we were only able to load the wounded at night, one by one. All 5 of our buses were damaged by artillery fire. The Russians were now only 2.5 kilometers away from us. One afternoon a senior sergeant came down to our cellar and asked us if we could give him some food. Fortunately, we were all right with our food supplies. He had an inordinate number of decorations. I asked him what unit he was serving in. Infantry Training School. Rigo and I looked at each other in amazement. What? This kind of unit still exists. Who's your commanding officer? The senior sergeant looked at us in confusion. He was obviously confused by the question. Something was wrong here. I invited him to sit down. Oh, come on, have a vodka. You have to tell me what happened. We're all just doctors here. No one's going to turn you in. So who do you report to? He gave me a grim look and answered briefly. I'm not stupid enough to obey anyone alone at a time like this. I'm just in the army. What are you doing here? Me. I'm fighting. There are a lot of Russians around. No one can accuse me of running away from them. How many men are with you? 30. And all instructors. All experienced sergeants. I suggested he stay with us. We had one vacant bomb shelter, although it was a bit out of the way. He could take shelter there with his men. If the Russians came, there must not be a single armed fighter on the hospital grounds. It was well known that this could end very badly. We hired an infantry training school for the service, just as others hire a troupe of entertainers. Although in a certain sense they were entertainers, masters of close combat, perfectly armed, no infantry unit of the Russians could match them. In those days it was not easy to cross the courtyard. To begin with, one had to make a careful survey of the neighborhood from the top of the stairs. One day Rigaud was standing there. He was dressed in a white coat, and in his hand he held a hammer, the kind of mallet that neurologists usually use in their practice. Just at that time Cossin was passing through the yard, and when he saw Rigaud, he asked, "Are we going to leave here, or are we staying here until the very end?" Over the next few days, the Russians approached the outskirts of the town, and during the day separate groups of Russian infantry tried to penetrate the factory grounds. At dusk, our friends from the training school drove them back, and so skillfully that we suffered no casualties ourselves. One day, a young lieutenant from another division came to our shelter to requisition a few rooms in the administration building to house their headquarters. We had plenty of room to spare. The number of wounded had decreased because the closer the front line came to us, the smaller became the line of defense from which the wounded came to us. But I refused to give him headquarters quarters. Then he became insistent. When I quoted to him an extract from the Geneva Convention, according to which combat units cannot be located on the territory of a hospital, he did not know how to react to this, and the conversation became more and more heated. But the tension subsided after the division commander came to us personally. He reached us on foot. The general was extremely surprised to learn that a field hospital could still be located in such a place, and he was exceptionally well disposed towards us. To him, the Geneva Convention was not an empty word. He immediately agreed to take over the villa of the former director of the factory, although by then it was already badly damaged. We invited the general to tea, and while he was getting ready, Moccasin's face was as imperturbable as an English butler's, being cornered Rigaud Matisse-san, and I did not want to miss the opportunity of pretending that there was nothing more natural to us than to have tea the moment the Russians stood on the doorstep. While we were sitting in this way, a double bang was suddenly heard, which caused us almost to fall from our chairs, and the candle fixed on the wall fell down. The 2 guns of our battery of 6-inch guns positioned themselves just behind our building and opened fire on the enemy. Naturally, the general did not refuse his masters their request and ordered the battery to take another position. The next day, instead of the division headquarters, the director's villa was occupied by the regimental headquarters, and as we were bidding farewell to the general and other officers, Matisse-san remarked with a smile, "If any gentleman happens to be in these parts again, we shall always be glad to invite him to tea." All, however, were silent. Silently, as at a funeral, they shook hands with us. That same evening I was ordered to report to the garrison medical chief, and we were all very hopeful that we would finally receive orders to pack up. I got into the last of our remaining vehicles, which had not yet been damaged by a direct hit from an artillery shell. I held the door open with my hand, so that if necessary I could jump out of the vehicle and hide somewhere, but the firing subsided for a time. Only a few bombs were dropped on the town, which was already in ruins. At the head of the garrison medical service gathered about 20 chiefs of field hospitals and commanders of medical units, who still remained in Heiligenbale. Our medical chief turned out to be a sturdy, gaunt, battle-hardened old warrior. He had led the evacuation of the wounded during the retreat from Minsk and had shown marvelous organizational skills. We sat down around a long table. He rose from his seat and said briefly, "Gentlemen, there is no possibility of holding Heiligenbale for at least the time required to evacuate the hospitals and other medical facilities. I therefore order you all to surrender to the Russians. By doing so, we are acting in accordance with the terms of the Geneva Convention." There was dead silence. The faces of 1 or 2 of those present immediately twisted. Most, however, behaved with dignity. So it was our turn. Without orders, no one had the right to leave what was still left of the cauldron. Even if all the authorities had ceased to function, the field gendarmerie was probably still guarding the docks at Rosenberg. Winter had already passed, so there was also no way to get out on the ice. Everyone present quickly dispersed. I stayed behind to find out something from the chief of medical services. For instance, I wanted to know if there was any hope of getting a retreat order, and also what to do with the wounded. I asked the colonel about it. He said that if we thought we could actually evacuate all our wounded, he would take me in as soon as we could. I went back to the factory. Rigaud, Matisse-san and the staff sergeant were still sitting in our little shelter waiting for me. Moccasin was making coffee. I sat down and looked carefully at each one's face. As I searched for a cigarette and lit a match, I repeated the statement of the garrison medical chief. "Gentlemen, there is no possibility of holding Heiligenbale for at least the time it takes to evacuate the hospitals and other medical facilities. We must remain in the cauldron and surrender to the Russians." Before I could even finish this sentence, Moccasin took a 50-mark note out of his pocket, rolled it into a tube, lit it with a candle, and began waving it around. "May I give the gentleman a light?" Without flinching a muscle, Rigaud took the torch and handed it to him. Everyone started laughing. Like the entire Western group, we were struck off the army's rolls. The curtain fell. We had to start learning Russian. The only one among us who spoke it well was the company's senior sergeant. In our little shelter, we found ourselves in exactly the same situation as, according to an ancient Oriental legend, a certain man from Assyria who fell down a well. Above was a threatened camel in the form of an order that cut him off from freedom. And below was a dragon named Politruk, just waiting for an opportunity to swallow us. White Mouse Day and Black Mouse Night gnawed at the roots of the bushes to which we clung, but like a man from an ancient Assyrian legend, we found solace in the rose of today's day, which was still fragrant right in front of us, but each of the remaining hours at our disposal was worth its weight in gold. Suddenly Matthieson broke the sepulchral silence, and I remember Schiller's entire poem, The Bell by Heart. Rigaud laughed. He was not feeling well. He had had a high fever for several days, although he had not told anyone about it. We assumed that it was a relapse of malaria which he had contracted on the Taman Peninsula, he said. Not bad. You probably went to one of those modern high schools. I went to a classical gymnasium. I learnt the first 200 lines of the Odyssey by heart as a sign of respect for the great creator. He started quoting them, and I thought of returning to Ithaca. I told the story of a corporal from Saxony who had fought in Russia in 1917 as part of the Field Brigade. I met him in Shanghai in 1924. He had escaped from Siberia through Mongolia, and a beautiful Chinese girl became his colleague. I don't know if he ever returned to his homeland. He probably should have tried to get to Turkey via the Caucasus, as the route to Ithaca is closer from Istanbul than from China. Like little boys huddled at night during a storm in a tent, they have pitched in the woods, who are unwilling to admit to themselves that they are frightened. We told each other stories of what we would do after we got home. A kind fairy named Hope promised us to regain all that we had lost. Paris, Penelope, the Prado Palace. All these memories from the past became a coveted goal of the distant future. If I had never been to Florence. I never finished reading Tristram Shandy. I never saw Greta Garbo. I had never seen Toscanini at La Scala. This is how, without even realizing what the future held for us, we told each other about the mistakes and omissions of the past. We had to destroy all documentation, and as I destroyed my notebook page by page, I could see my past burning in the flames of the furnace. Antoinette. I visited her in Paris in 1939 and 1940 and stood in front of the closed door of her flat on Mont Valérien. The concierge told me that she had left for America a few days before the war broke out. Dr. K.O. Setzen. We studied together in Frankfurt, and I was a guest of his in Peking. I may forget the Chinese characters for his address in Peking, but I can find him anyway. His family lived in this house for 300 years. See Captain Fink von Labo. I travelled with him on the first sea voyage of my life. Our paths would cross again somewhere in a harbour tavern in Antwerp or in Liguria. We would tell each other hundreds of different stories that would suddenly emerge from the most secret corners of our memories. In a short time, all of life's values changed. Watches became completely useless, but we each pulled on 2 pairs of socks, one on top of the other. The moccasin showed us how to wrap a 3rd pair around the foot as well. This helped to keep the feet warm, and besides, another pair was kept in reserve. It was necessary to destroy all stocks of vodka. The Russians were not to have any. Once drunk, they could do anything. We poured 100 bottles into a sink in the bomb shelter. At the entrance, we put up a big poster that said hospital in Russian. At least there was still some chance that they wouldn't machine gun the basement before going in. Earlier, one of the hospitals had been captured by the Russians for a while, and when it was recaptured, it was found that nothing bad had happened to the wounded, but they'd had taken all the doctors away with them. We were told that the German doctors were immediately sent to the Russian field hospitals, as the Russians realized that with the huge losses they usually suffered, their own doctors could not cope with such an influx of wounded. We still had 20 wounded in our care, and lately hardly any patients had been brought to us. There were hardly any fighting units left in front of us. In the latter part of the night, we loaded our wounded into ambulances, but the drivers were only able to evacuate 12 men through the port of Rosenberg. They brought back the remaining 8, having waited in vain for several hours for the next transport ship in the harbour. This time they were under fire. 8 wounded. We had enough men to carry them on stretchers. The staffing in our hospital was superb. Discipline was out of the question. People were doing the best they could. Moccasin and I had a Romanian medal with the inscription Crusade Against Communism, which had been awarded to us by the King of Romania. We never wore them, and I'd forgotten about it, but suddenly I remembered. Throw the medals away. But such a decision seemed wrong to me, so I asked Moccasin what he thought about it. He grinned. Not throw them away, but give them a ceremonial burial. So at least that problem was solved. The next day there was a very heavy artillery bombardment, which we had never encountered before. We counted up to 20 direct hits on the building, and we expected that the first Russians could come down the steps of our bomb shelter any moment. Rigau, who was shaking with fever, lay in a small room on the top bunk, which here were arranged in 2 tiers. We still had telephone communication with the outside world, and it was by telephone that we learnt that the Russians had made a major attack on Hiligin Bale in the afternoon, but that it had been repulsed. This meant that we had at least 12, perhaps 24 hours to spare. During the night, the order came that all medics who were qualified as counsellors could leave Hiligin Bale. Apart from Rigau, who was the Army Group's chief psychiatrist, this also applied to the Army Group's chief surgeon and pathologist. I shook Rigau to wake him up. "Now, come on, get up. You can go." Written orders. You are chartered a starboard cabin on the lower deck of the Rosenberg Pillow voyage. With great difficulty he climbed down from the upper deck and plumped himself into a chair. His eyelids closed by themselves. I felt his pulse. His temperature was at least 40 degrees centigrade. He glanced up at me. "We have shared all the troubles and hardships with you for so long, so I won't leave you now." I tried to change his mind, but he remained adamant. Meanwhile, the other 2 officers had stowed their rucksacks. I noticed with slight disappointment that they were taking care of some things at a time when they could easily have parted with their own lives. One of them was a brilliant surgeon in uniform, and the other was a brilliant pathologist in uniform, but none of them were actually real military men. I walked over to Rigau again. He was sitting on the table, and Moccasin was steaming him down with very strong coffee. I started saying, "Are you going to let those 2 tourists go straight into the clutches of the Russians? They'll never find their way into the harbour on their own at night, especially under that kind of shelling. Just because you're lazy?" Rigau looked at me unhappily, but I went on. "I want to tell you one thing, my dear friend. If those 2 don't get to Pillow, you'll have a guilty conscience for the rest of your life." For the most part, this statement had real grounds. In fact, it was by no means possible to leave either the surgeon or the pathologist to their fate. Neither of them would have found their way, especially under fire. We had already consumed the inviolable reserve during dinner. Rigau stood up, buckled his belt, slipped on his steel helmet. Moccasin stuffed several packets of cigarettes into his pockets. Rigau shook my hand. "See you soon, you old bastard. Be careful." He disappeared with the 2 counsellors into the darkness of the night, illuminated by the flashes of bursts, and Mathiasen and I were left alone. The next day the attempted assault was again repeated. Just after noon the Russians again attempted to attack the town, but were again repulsed. The Russian infantry were at the limit of their strength, exhausted by the continuous fighting that had been going on for weeks. Towards evening the firing subsided a little, and we began to load the remaining wounded onto ambulances. I then reported to the garrison medical chief that the hospital was empty, and the 2 days' reprieve, which we had unexpectedly gained through the steadfastness of the German soldiers, made it possible to establish transport links, and we received permission to evacuate. Mathiesen prepared the equipment for a temporary operating theatre. Of course, with it we could not do laparotomy, but for amputations it was quite suitable. We distributed this equipment among the knapsacks of our men, the French prisoners of war and the Russian. I had ordered that no personal belongings should be taken with us, and as a result there was even room in the knapsacks for medicines, preparations and bandages, armed with machine guns and rifles that the hospital had left behind for the wounded. We began to leave the former administration building in small groups. As we reached the road leading towards Rosenberg, we had to wade through unfriendly terrain riddled with shell craters, past destroyed houses. All was quiet. There was a brief lull after the 2 Russian attacks had been repulsed. Apparently, it would have been better for Rigaud and his companions if they had stayed with us. However, they did not turn back and apparently either perished or made it to Pillow after all. There was utter chaos on the wharves in the harbour. A large number of dead horses were lying among the burnt-out vehicles. In the darkness, Matheson bent over the body of a dead soldier. "Minnie, I'm sorry," he whispered, then straightened up and put his hand to his visor. Our small groups approached one by one. Many wounded men, brought here from the hospitals on the front line, were piled up near the docks. They were lying on the open ground, completely unprotected from artillery fire. As soon as the barges arrived, the medical units in the harbour loaded a batch of wounded on them. This gave one of them the right to also load onto the barges. The wounded left lying on the wharf were taken into the care of the next medical unit. While we were waiting to be loaded in the harbour, it was covered by several volleys of artillery, but all had reached that degree of indifference at which the feeling of fear completely disappears. We did not even begin to seek shelter for ourselves. What were we to do? Would we be able to get out of here? It was very doubtful whether, owing to the heavy shelling during the remaining night hours, the barges would again be able to make their way to the harbour. It was beginning to get light. At last the barge intended for us arrived, and we were loaded on it in less than 20 minutes. The major of the field gendarmerie was standing by the gangway, and I tried in vain to make conversation with him. When French prisoners of war tried to come on board, "Who are these people?" "They're British pals who worked as orderlies in the hospital. They're staying here." It was a desperate situation. The major had not yet seen our Russian nurses. With all the politeness I could muster, I explained to him that I had given my word to take them with me. He simply had no right to let me break my word. He replied cold. "They stay here." No argument worked. There was nothing I could do about him. Although he had exactly the same rank as me, he was in a more favourable position because he was in the performance of his immediate duties. To leave the French here, what a meanness! To stay here with them is foolishness. To shoot that officer was murder. The captain of the barge ordered his men to give up the moorings. All these problems didn't concern him. I was in despair. Suddenly a terrible noise came from a neighbouring barge, which was only 20 metres away, and at the same time there was a rumble of exploding mines near the harbour. The major dived for cover. I remained standing where I was and was a little surprised that he didn't even bother to see what had happened on the other barge. The French and Russian girls jumped onto the barge, which was already pulling away from the dock, and I jumped in after them. When I looked around, the barge was already a few meters from the quay, and someone was following it. We pulled him aboard. It was Moccasin. I asked him where he was, and he pointed his finger over his shoulder. The noise can't arise by itself. He knew at once from my look that I would not be able to negotiate with the major, and then he climbed onto a neighbouring barge and switched on the siren there. At dawn we entered Pillow harbour. We found ourselves in yet another cauldron. More than 2 weeks after leaving Rosenberg harbour, I was once again sitting on the deck of the ship. Taking advantage of the morning fog, this ship had left Gila, a seaport in the Bay of Danzig. It was the end of April. It was a good ship, making up to 18 nautical knots per hour. There was no escort convoy. We were alone at sea. The sick and wounded were lying, sitting, and even standing on the crowded deck. Probably as many as 5,000 people were on board. Of these, 2,000 were lying on stretchers in the hold, on the utes the refugees had gathered. They sat there in silence, stripped of all their possessions, with starving children in their arms, victims of war. Even in such circumstances, the only people who tried to do anything for the people around them were the medics and their assistants. Matthiessen had set up an operating theatre between the decks. The quartermaster of our hospital was able to do the almost impossible. He obtained from the starving town of Gila such a quantity of food that it should have sufficed for 5,000 people for 2 or 3 days. 3 camp kitchens had been set up on the half bank, and the cooks were hard at work. I looked back. The artillery fire which the Russians had been firing on Gila Harbour from Oxeft now seemed only distant flashes. The fog had turned into a light haze that could serve as excellent cover from enemy aircraft. Shells were circling above the ship. While I was looking at them, I suddenly remembered a solitary gull I had seen during a storm on the Sea of Azov. Its shrill cry, which broke through the howling of the wind, was in some mystical way an omen of all that happened to us afterwards. The sea was calm. Slowly the low waves rolled in. There was still a danger that a low, frothy turbulence might appear on the surface of the water, which would fire a volley of this silvery haze at us, and we would all go to the bottom. There were experienced sailors on the bridge who were watching the surface of the sea with binoculars. If a frothy trail appeared, there was still a possibility of manoeuvring to evade the enemy's volley, but personally I had nothing else to do but to recall my experiences and make plans for the future. Moccasin had thoughtfully thought to bring one thing that did not ask for food, but turned out to be very useful. When boarding the ship, we passed through the cordons set up by the field gendarmerie in the harbour of Gila, and all soldiers and officers, without exception, had to surrender their weapons. This was done because a few days earlier, a group of determined fellows had seized a ship leaving Gila harbour and, at gunpoint, had persuaded the captain to go to Stockholm. I was completely unarmed, and soon after we left the harbour I was suddenly confronted by an angry mob. Only general apathy kept it from open revolt. A large number of soldiers had fallen behind their units, and they were now an amorphous mass ruled by anarchic instincts. Moccasin had foreseen this possibility. He dragged me into a corner and then, with a movement impossible to describe, slipped his hand into his trousers and drew out a small, elegant revolver. It was suspended between his legs by a rope. I slipped it into my belt and carried it as cowboys do. Naturally, such a weapon was of little use, but the fact of having it was important. We distributed food, and many of the soldiers shared with the women on the ute. But to ensure a fair distribution of food, we had to divide the soldiers on deck into separate groups. In such a situation, the presence of weapons acted as a very calming influence. All these soldiers had been through incredible hardships and dangers, and none of them were going to risk their lives in the slightest degree again, especially since rescue was so close at hand. It just so happened that for the last time during this war, weapons had to be used to persuade the soldiers of the once valiant army not to resent the distribution of barley soup in which tiny pieces of horse meat were floating. In olden times, wars were no less cruel than they are today. But then, at any rate, it was possible to end them without much cruelty. Kings could admit their defeat. The defeated king in Shakespeare's play looks quite dignified, but the defeated tyrant does not look dignified even in a film. See him, the modern tyrant, who thinks of himself as nothing less than the ruler of the entire real world, must first be stripped of his roots and branches. Even the dictator recognized this fact. It is therefore not surprising that he refused to admit defeat. Since his power was by no means symbolic, his fall brought nothing but a great deal of misery to innocent people. In Zemlandia, the westernmost region of East Prussia, the same senseless slaughter that had previously taken place at Heiligenbiel was repeated, a complete defeat of the German forces, which was caused by the fact that the High Command continued to make one mistake after another. The only thing that remained unchanged until the very end of the war was the unwillingness of the High Command to consider common sense. The hastily organized defense of the remaining occupied Russian part of East Prussia was swept away in a matter of days. The army lost its fighting ability as a result of senseless orders, terrible panic, and senseless, though amazingly courageous resistance. As soon as we managed to escape from the cauldron at Heiligenbiel, before we even had time to realize the fact that we had been rescued, We immediately set to work in Zemlandia. I got to the quarters, which had been occupied by our fastidious quartermaster, who had gone to Pillow a few days before us. He had already caught some small fish and began to fry them at once. I learnt that Rigaud was in Pillow and sent a messenger to he came to see us at once, though he was ill. He got out of Heligen bail without much trouble. The next day he was given a place on the ship and got home safely. It took us a couple of hours to eat the fish, and the same couple of hours were enough to keep our hospital from being transferred to Königsberg, which was soon taken. When I reached the house occupied by the Chief of Medical Service of the Army Corps, I met there the medical company commander, who had just received a similar order. Had I arrived half an hour earlier, we would have received it. We were ordered to be stationed in the bunkers where the torpedoes were stored, in the Peissen forest west of Königsberg, and we contrived to do surgery there for the next fortnight. A few days before the assault on the city began, however, we were transferred to Palmniken on the coast of Zemlandia, where I took over a reserve hospital with 300 patients. This hospital had previously been a civilian hospital. Although dozens of Russian planes flew over us every day for weeks, not a single trench was dug. We were able to transfer 300 patients to Pillow in 2 days. It looked as if we were stuck here for a long time and everyone was waiting for the Russian offensive to begin. The Frenchmen who were with us had taken refuge in a bunker cut into the coastal rocks. There they were going to wait for the Allies to come. One day in the evening twilight I went to see them together with Mathiasine. We were standing at the edge of the sea. Somewhere out there, on the opposite shore of the Baltic Sea, was Stockholm, Europe, freedom. Somewhere out there people were drinking cocktails, loving each other, doing business. They were probably spinning the radio to find out how far the Russians, British or Americans had advanced. When this war would finally end, we stared in silence at the grey, impenetrable surface of the water and suddenly noticed a small star appear in the distance. A star. It was probably shining just for us, although it seemed that for the foreseeable future, our only occupation was to serve as a target for Russian bombs and shells, and the hospital was heavily wounded. We at least managed to guess the right numbers in the game of chance called roulette, into which the evacuation by sea had become. That's how we eventually ended up in Gila. My indomitable Silesians loaded into their huge rucksacks all the equipment needed for the temporary surgical hospital, regardless of any risk. At Gila, I went to the officer in charge of loading all the medical units. Our chances of evacuation were by no means brilliant. We arrived too late. There were already many medical units piled up here waiting to be loaded onto ships. For a long time, Mathiesen and I wandered around the evacuation headquarters, thinking about what we should do. Having come up with nothing, we went inside the building. The officer in charge of the evacuation, a handsome young medical captain, was talking to a grey-haired lieutenant colonel, the chief of the regiment's medical service. I was greatly impressed by his politeness, for at that time it had somehow disappeared from common usage. When the lieutenant colonel left, the young captain approached us with a friendly but frankly ironic smile. Presumably the gentleman would like to go to Copenhagen. He said it as if he were Thomas Cook. I was up again for many nights in a row, but despite my fatigue, I pulled myself together. The question is not do we want to. We have to go there. That's an order. 2 minutes later, we were sitting in his room, glasses of vodka in our hands. He told us that he had already been offered 1,000 marks for the shipment, but that wasn't the worst. He had seen the weeping of the young, old, seen-it-all officers. Many medical units had piled up in the harbour, but surgical teams were still in great short supply, as most of them were without equipment. But as we still had it, the next night we loaded into a good ship, which took us now westwards from Gila. Our future fate, however, was still uncertain. We could head for Swinemunde if we got into another mess. During the night we passed the dangerous Bornholm Strait and only then set course for Mogens Klint, a lighthouse south of Copenhagen. The next morning we entered the harbour of Copenhagen. When the spires of the city buildings appeared on the horizon, I realized that I had managed to survive. and I decided that one day I would write about my experiences. I dedicated my work to the memory of those who served under the invisible flag and gave their lives for the sake of others. Their graves are scattered all over the earth. The god of war has not only released his demons, he has also released his angels. And while the demons are wreaking havoc, the angels are quietly going about their business. None of us is personally to blame for the rampant barbarism. However, there are no innocents among us, and those who have given their lives to save others have lightened the load of our responsibility a little. Therefore, the invisible flag under which they died can by no means be the flag of a deliberately losing cause, and therein lies the justification of their deaths. As we approached the wharf, Mathisen came up on deck from his operating theatre. The sun was shining brightly, and its warmth warmed us. He nudged me lightly, laughed, and said, "Remember that little star." We went down to the shore to watch the unloading of the sick and wounded. We walked past the harbour warehouses, past the customs office and out into the town. Next to the harbour stood an ancient, well-fortified fortress. It was spring, and the walls of the fortress were covered with bright green. We looked carefully at the sky. Now, however, the bright sunlight did not mean that bombing was about to begin. Spring did not mean that another Russian offensive was about to begin. We sat down on a bench that stood next to a bed of blooming tulips. There were birds chirping in the bushes. 2 little girls, about 5 years old, dressed all in white, were strolling, holding hands along a gravel path, with their nanny following behind, holding an umbrella in her hand. As they approached the 2 hunched creatures sitting on a bench in their tattered, sun-bleached uniforms, the children gave them a leering, frightened look. We sat in silence. We didn't want to think about anything else. Then Mathisen put his hand on my shoulder, and, like a pair of old steppe wolves, he said, sitting in the sun, licking their wounds,